Dark Sun, A Little Knowledge by Jerry Oltion. Copyright 1991, TSR Inc. All rights reserved. Created by Oltion Inc. Dark Sun and the TSR logo are trademarks owned by TSR Inc. The lightning bolt came out of a clear sky. Jedra, busy haggling over the price of a new water skin, flinched as the bright blue flash illuminated the food and clothing and harness stands around him. In the same instant, a thunderclap rattled the entire bazaar and echoed off the adobe brick walls of the 1- and 2-story buildings surrounding it. Jedra turned, ears ringing, to see a 4-slave sedan chair on the ground, only a few yards away. The overweight Templar it had carried angrily brushing sand off his black robe of office, while 3 heavily muscled slaves frantically ride the chair. The 4th slave lay on the ground, a patch of melted sand a few inches across bubbling beside his smoking body. The slave must have stumbled and pitched the Templar out, Jedra supposed, and the Templar had killed him for it. Case closed. Activity had stopped in the bazaar, but as others came to the same conclusion, it picked up again. Jedra turned back to the water vendor, a leathery old elf with an eye patch over his left eye, and said, "All right, 2 ceramics for the water skin, but only if it's full." The elf peered at Jedra, no doubt trying to judge how far he could push this young, skinny half-elf, but at last he nodded. "Done?" he said, and he filled the teardrop-shaped leather sack from a barrel at the back of his stand, careful not to spill a single drop, while Jedra dug into his pouch for 2 fragments of ceramic coin. They were the last of Jedra's money. If he was to eat today, he would have to find work or scavenge something he could sell. Taking the skin from the elf, he drained a 1/4 of its contents in 2 long swallows, then slung it around his shoulder by the strap, the weight of it comforting. At least he wouldn't go thirsty today. The Templar was already gone when he turned around again, as was the sedan chair and the slave's body. All that remained of the incident was the small, glassy pool where the lightning bolt had melted the sand. Ever curious, Jedra kicked at it with the toe of his sandal, and a piece of glass flaked off the top. It was several inches across and an inch or so thick in the middle, but thinner around the edges. He bent down and picked up the fragment, then nearly dropped it again when he looked into it. There, amid the bubbles and streaks, danced a tiny upside-down image of a thry-crane. He looked beyond the glass. The actual creature stood across the way, its 6-limbed, mantis-like insectile body glistening in the sunlight as it examined a githka, a polyarm with blades at either end at an armorer's stall. The thry-crane seemed oblivious to Jedra and his glass. Cautiously, lest he be less fortunate a second time, Jedra looked through the glass again, turning slowly and watching as the upside-down bazaar slid by backward. No one noticed that they had been turned on their heads, if indeed they had. Jedra put his free hand out beyond the glass to see if he could feel any sensation. A point of bright light slid across his wrist, and when he paused to look at it, he felt a sudden sting of heat. The glass had burned him. Jedra rubbed at his wrist, but he smiled. The glass must still hold a bit of the lightning bolt that had created it. That might be worth something to the right person. He glanced at a spice stand draped with herbs and roots, a stand that was rumored to be a black market outlet for the things used in the creation of magic. The proprietor would probably buy the glass from him. He took a few steps toward the stand, then stopped, realizing he was reluctant to part with his new treasure so soon. A half-breed elf with no home and no magical training didn't often find himself in possession of wondrous devices. He had no doubt he would have to sell it eventually, but the day was still young and his hunger was still bearable. He would see what else the glass could do first. He found a quiet spot just off the bazaar, in an alley lined with continuous mud-brick row houses. Their wooden doors and windows were closed tight to hold in the cool air from the previous night, giving Jedra privacy to experiment. In just a few minutes, he discovered the glass's major power and the reason he'd been burned when held at the right distance. It made things seem greater than they really were, including the heat of Aethys's coppery red sun. Why most things remained only images while the sun actually seemed to appear beneath the glass was a mystery, as was the reason why objects beyond arm's reach of the glass were turned upside down. He had just ignited a dead leaf, no doubt blown into the alley from the king's garden, since few of the freemen living in the row houses would willingly spend the water to keep a plant alive when he felt a presence in his mind, as if someone were watching him. He had learned to trust that sensation. He looked up to see a human nobleman of about 60 years, his hair as white as his robe, standing at the far end of the alley, mouth open in astonishment. Cursing his carelessness, Jadra stood and began to walk quickly toward the bazaar again. The man must have seen the leaf bursting into flame and would certainly draw the obvious conclusion that Jedra was using the glass to power some sort of magic. Just as obviously, Jedra was not a Templar, and by law, only Templars and the Sorcerer King himself were allowed to use magic. A commoner caught practicing, it could be sold into slavery, even executed. Unused to magic or its implications, Jedra hadn't even considered that danger. He considered it now. Suddenly sweating, he sprinted for the bazaar, hoping to lose himself in the crowd, but he had hardly made it a dozen paces before the noble found his voice. The shout of, "Stop him!" pursued Jedra out of the alley, and he emerged to find everyone looking in his direction. None of the dozens of shoppers made a move to catch him, probably thinking him an ordinary thief, but when the noble emerged from the alley behind him and shouted, "A magician! Stop him!" they sprang into action. A tall, massive half-giant, with arms the size of Jedra's legs, swung a sack of grain off one shoulder just as Jedra ran past, catching him square in the back with it. He staggered forward under the blow, but kept his footing, only to slam into a compact, muscle-bound dwarf. The dwarf's blocky head reached only to Jedra's chest, just high enough to burst his new water skin with the impact. He dodged around the dwarf, but the entire bazaar seemed out to get him now. A noble's order was almost as good as law, especially an order the Templars would so obviously support. None of the crowd wished to be caught disobeying that order, lest they be accused of aiding in an escape. Such people often found themselves sharing their quarry's fate. Jedra whirled and leaped back into the alley, dodging dwarf and half-giant and bowling over the noble, but he skidded to a stop when he realized that the noble's cry had brought people running from the other end, too. He was trapped. He looked to either side, but saw only the closed doors and shuttered windows of the row houses lining the alley. Could he leap to a windowsill, and from there to a roof? Not likely, but he could think of nothing else to try. He crouched to spring, but when he jumped, it felt as if he'd kicked a hole in the ground rather than launched himself into action. He heard astonished gasps from the crowd and looked down to see a shimmering circle of darkness beneath his feet. He had just enough time to scream before he fell through. He landed on his feet on hard-packed dirt, but the remains of his abortive leap and a sudden rush of disorientation combined to send him sprawling. He threw out his hands to stop his fall, and the glass flew from his grasp to skitter to a stop in a circle of ash next to a pair of dark leather boots. Straining to see in the dim light, Jedra raised his head to find who the boots belonged to. A short, wiry man with dark curly hair stood before him. The man bent down to pick up the glass, took stock of his surroundings, though the circle of ash around the man's feet told him plenty. He was a magician, and not a Templar either. Templars drew their power from the city's Sorcerer King, but other magicians had to draw upon the life force around them. Every time a magician cast a spell, he drew his energy from the plant life and fertile soil around him. If a mage wasn't careful, he drew all the life force from an area, reducing it to ash. "Who are you?" asked Jedra, as he stood and took stock of his surroundings, though the circle of ash around the man's feet told him plenty. He was a magician, and not a Templar either. Templars drew their power from the city's Sorcerer King, but other magicians had to draw upon the life force around them. Every time a magician cast a spell, he drew his energy from the plant life and fertile soil around him. If a mage wasn't careful, He drew all the life force from an area, reducing it to ash. The man didn't answer. He examined the glass carefully, nearly dropping it when he saw upside-down images of the room slide through it. "Oh ho," he said. "So, this is what caused all the commotion. Is it your work?" Jedra had no idea how to respond. He looked around him and saw that he was in a one-room house, with a cot in one corner, a plank table and 2 chairs in another, a wooden chest and cabinet in a third, and a workbench covered with scrolls and wands and unfamiliar tools in the fourth. A window in one wall opened onto a shared courtyard and allowed a shaft of sunlight to illuminate the room. The window in the opposite wall was shuttered, but Jedra could hear the mob shouting in confusion just beyond it. Obviously, the man had rescued him with some kind of spell, but for what reason, Jedra couldn't guess. Finally, he simply said, "Maybe." "Good answer," the man said. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Dornal, mage, and member of the Veiled Alliance." Jedra considered making up a name, but there seemed little point in lying to a mage. "Jedra," he said. Dornal smiled. "I was right to rescue you, Jedra. You have powers the Alliance would love to learn." "You have heard of us, haven't you?" Jedra nodded. Of course he had. The Veiled Alliance was supposedly a league of mages opposed to the Sorcerer King and his Templars and to unscrupulous magicians in general. They worked to put life force back into the world rather than use it up to power their spells. They were a secretive bunch whose existence Jedra had only half believed until now. "I was looking through the shutter when I saw you practicing your burning spell," said Dornal as he squinted to see the images in the glass. "I assume this is used for that as well?" He swung around toward the open window. "Don't look at the sun." The mage lowered the glass and studied Jedra from beneath narrowed brows. "It magnifies things, even sunlight. You could burn your eye with it." "Oh." Dornal examined the glass with renewed interest. "And what were you doing with it?" "Experimenting, of course." A subtle change in the noise from outside made Dornal step to the window and peer through the cracks in the shutter. Then he turned suddenly away. "They've brought in Templars to search the area for magic. We've got to go." He walked to the cabinet, pulled out a cloth traveling bag, and began to throw clothing and valuables into it. The lightning glass went into the bag, Jedra noticed. "Go where?" he asked. "We must leave the city for a time," said Dornal. "I risked a great deal in stealing you away right out in the open like that. Templars can trace the use of magic, and they don't like to be publicly thwarted. They'll search for us for many days before they give up." "Days?" "That's right. So we would be wise to stay out of their path until that time passes." Dornal pulled a long, multicolored tunic from the cabinet and tossed it to Jedra. "Here, put that on." Jedra complied, seeing the wisdom in that at least. He was about to argue about the idea of leaving the city when Dornal tossed him a leather sack and said, "Keep that out of sight." Jedra nearly collapsed when he opened it and saw a double handful of silver and gold coins. He'd never before held even a single silver piece. A fortune this size would take him a dozen lifetimes to earn and at least a lifetime to spend. If Dornal trusted someone he'd just met with such wealth, then the man must be a powerful mage indeed. And if so, then he certainly knew more about keeping himself safe from Templars than Jedra did. The boy stripped off his ruined water skin and used its tie to secure the money bag around his neck, making certain it hung hidden beneath his tunic. Dornal tossed another money sack into his traveling bag, tied it closed, and stepped to the back door. "Coming?" he asked. Jedra couldn't see that he had much choice, not if the Templars were looking for him. "I guess," he said, and followed the mage out the door. Within hours, he found himself sharing a cramped cabin in an upper deck of a merchant caravan headed for the city of Tyr. It was hardly a caravan, really, just a single enormous wooden wagon pulled by 2 equally enormous maquillets long, wide lizard-like creatures with hide thick enough to turn arrows. The wagon they drew looked like a castle on rollers, complete with battlements from which guards could fire on the raiders and wild beasts that roamed the desert. Inside was a warren of decks and compartments with enough cargo capacity to hold an entire bazaar's worth of goods. This wagon's cargo also included slaves, destined to labor and probably die on the ziggurat being built for the sorcerer king of Tyre. Jedra shuddered when he thought of the poor creatures huddled in darkness just a few decks below his own. Had it not been for Dornell's intervention, he might have found himself in a similar situation. The dry, musky smell of mackillet hide poured in through the single-foot-square porthole in their cabin, but closing the shutter would have been worse. They'd only just left the city, but Jedra was already sweating with the heat, and he knew it would get much worse as the day wore on. They needed all the fresh air they could get, even if it did smell of dust and lizard. They also needed the sunlight the window admitted. Dornell was examining Jedra's mysterious piece of glass, holding it up to the light and branding lines into the tiny tabletop jutting out from the opposite wall. "It doesn't seem to need life force to power it," he said. "Truly astonishing. What else does it do? You saw how it magnifies things." Jedra said. He was sitting on the edge of the cabin's single bunk, trying to keep from getting sick with the swaying of the wagon. "Yes, yes, and it makes distant things look smaller and upside down," said Dornell. "I fail to see the usefulness of that unless you could actually make something become smaller and upside down. Is there a spell for that, perhaps?" "I don't know," Jedra said. "I don't think so." "You don't think so?" Dornell peered at Jedra through the glass. "You know, it's becoming quite clear to me that you know very little about this. This device. You didn't make it yourself, did you?" Jedra had been dreading this moment. He considered lying, but he knew he'd be caught in an instant. Reluctantly, he said, "No, but I saw how it was made." "Did you now? Tell me about it. What spells were used?" Dornell was obviously testing him. Carefully, Jedra described how the Templar called down the lightning bolt and how he had found the glass afterward. "A lightning spell?" Dornell mused when he was done. "Yes, I suppose there might be enough energy in a lightning spell to make something like this, but if the Templar didn't fashion it on purpose, then I don't suppose he knows anything more about it than you do." "Probably not. And you know next to nothing. You're not a mage at all, are you?" "No," Jedra admitted. Hopefully, he added, "But I bet I could learn." Dornell laughed softly, and his laugh sent a chill down Jedra's spine. "Oh, no doubt you could. You've got potential. I can sense it in you, but I see no point in training my own competition." He waved an arm, and Jedra felt his muscles lock into place. The wagon lurched, one of its wheels no doubt falling into a circle of ash that suddenly appeared beneath it as the magician above cast his spell. Unable to keep his balance, Jedra toppled to his side on the bunk. With effort, he could still speak. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Retrieving what's mine." Dornell knelt beside Jedra and removed the money bag from beneath the boy's tunic. "Thank you for carrying this past the gate guards for me," he said, pouring into his hand a collection of crystals and amulets that would have marked anyone as a magician on sight. "I wasn't sure we'd make it past them unchallenged." Dornell had cast some kind of illusion on the bag, Jedra realized. He kicked at the magician with all his strength, but his spellbound leg hardly moved. "You used me," he hissed. "I did. Get used to it. It's going to happen a lot where you're going." "Where's that?" For answer, Dornell merely pointed downward. Then he waved his hand again, and Jedra lost consciousness entirely. Jedra woke to intense heat and the smell of dozens of sweaty, unwashed bodies. The only light came from two barred windows set indoors on either end of the hold, the doors themselves opening only into dim companionways, but the boy didn't need light to know where he was. Dornell had sold him into slavery, probably for little more than the cost of his passage. He'd taken back his tunic, too. Jedra now wore a simple breechcloth. He sat up and looked around him. There were 20 or 30 others in the hold with him, all bound at wrists and ankles with heavy leather manacles and tied to the wall with ropes attached to the collars around their necks. Jedra saw that the slave master hadn't been picky. There were humans, dwarves, an elf, even one of the insectile Thri-Kreen. "What did you do?" crossed the wagon master. A female voice asked. He turned and saw a short, round-faced human woman sitting beside him. She wore a halter in addition to her breechcloth. "I trusted a magician," he said after a moment. She laughed, but not unkindly. "Not a wise idea," she said. A dwarf 2 people beyond her did laugh unkindly, but not at Jedra. In a voice like distant thunder, he said, "You should talk, Templar." The other slaves laughed. Jedra stared at the woman in open amazement. "She's a Templar?" "Wrong," she said to the dwarf. "I was a healer. My powers are psionic, not magical, and to be a Templar you've got to know magic." Jedra knew next to nothing about psionics, the mental abilities that some people could call upon instead of magic, save that such powers supposedly didn't require life energy to fuel them. He had wondered if his own ability to know when people were watching him was psionic, but he'd never before found anyone who could tell him. He was about to ask the woman beside him, but the dwarf wasn't through taunting her. "You worked for the Templars," he said. "That's practically the same thing. Slaves work for the Templars too." She spat back at him. "But you got paid for it. Blood money," said the dwarf. Jedra normally wouldn't have gotten mixed up in someone else's argument, but he wanted to talk with this woman. Besides, he couldn't help noticing that, given a bath and a chance to brush out her shoulder-length brown hair, she would be rather pretty. It was enough to make him say, "Does it matter? We're all slaves now." The dwarf growled. "Yeah, thanks to the likes of her. And maybe you too, eh? You like Templars, do you?" Stunned by the sudden accusation, Jedra stammered, Of course not. I mean, stay out of it. I can take care of myself." Aloud, she said, "Leave him alone. And leave me alone too, or I'll heal your mouth closed for you." "Huh." The dwarf snorted, but Jedra noticed that he shut up. The woman turned her attention back to Jedra. "So, just how did trusting a magician get you here?" Jedra told her the whole story about the piece of lightning glass, ending with Dornell's betrayal. "He told you he was one of those who wear the veil?" she asked. "That's right. Well, that was his first lie. The Veiled Alliance really are honest magicians, for the most part. But they're secretive as thieves when it comes to talking about it, and they hate people like this Dornell. I wish I'd known that before." Jedra said. She laughed again. "We all wish we'd known something we didn't, or we wouldn't be here, that's for sure. What's your name, anyway?" "Jedra. What's yours?" "Cayenne." Jedra looked up and down the slavehold, but the other slaves had already lost interest in the 2 of them. He leaned close to her anyway. Softly, he asked, "How did you do that when you spoke to me in my mind?" "You mean sending thoughts?" "It's a simple psionic power." It wasn't quite like hearing her voice, but Jedra understood her words perfectly. His intention to ask about his own ability vanished in a sudden, more immediate question. "How far can you reach with that?" he asked excitedly. "Depends on how well I can visualize the person I'm trying to contact." She said aloud, "If it's someone I know, I can talk to them almost anywhere. Otherwise, they've got to be close. Then you can call for help." She shook her head. "Who would I ask? Most of the people I know were the ones who put me here in the first place. They'd think it was real funny hearing from me now. But there must be somebody. Look, nobody I know is going to come after a caravan just to rescue a couple of slaves. So unless you know someone, the Jura Dai would." The voice was high and pure and came from directly across the hold from Jedra. He looked up to see an elf staring at him. His eyes were set close in a narrow face, and his nose was slender and long. Everything about him was long. Even bent at the knees, his legs stretched nearly across to Jedra, and his reddish blonde hair reached the floor despite being braided. He was like an exaggerated version of Jedra himself, whose elven features had been rounded and shortened by his human heritage. "What?" Cayenne asked. "I am Galar of the Jura Day tribe. My people would come for me if they knew I was here. They'd attack a caravan just for you." Galar laughed. "There is plenty of treasure on board too." Jedra said to Cayenne, "You can send a message to his tribe." Cayenne shook her head. "I don't know anyone in his tribe, so unless they're traveling along right beside us, I can't reach them." "You could try, and get myself blasted unconscious by the guards." "Huh? How would they know you'd done anything?" She looked at him like he had drool on his chin. "One of the guards is a psionicist. That's one of the ways they keep slaves in line. He'll be watching for escape attempts." "Oh." Cayenne's expression softened. "Look, I'd try it in a minute if I thought it'd work, but I know my limits. I can't contact any random elf out there. That's just not the way it works." Jedra nodded, feeling hope drain out of him, but a sudden thought checked his plunge into despair. "Wait a minute. These psionic powers of yours, are they something you can teach?" "Well, you've got to have some inherent ability, but otherwise, yes, it's possible." "Why?" Jedra nodded toward Galar. "You could teach him. He knows plenty of elves." Cayenne looked at Jedra as if he'd just suggested escaping by a trap door and then shown her one at her own feet. But she'd been a slave long enough to know how debilitating false hope could be. "Well," she said cautiously, "it might be worth a try."